welcome to those of you in the room and to those of you out there somewhere. Welcome to the Institute of Manufacturing and this Babbage Forum meeting, where we're going to hear from people who were successful in our first Babbage essay competition last year. We have a wonderful diversity of original contributions to this very topical field of industrial strategy and policy. Without further ado, I'm going to ask our first speaker to come and address us, please.
So, well, hello, good morning, everyone. The mic should be working. Okay. Yep. Okay, that should be working now. So, well, good to see you all finally after a year's time, and thank you very much for the invitation. Well, my name is Mikel Zavala, and I'll be presenting the paper, one of the papers that got the Babbage Award last year. It's a paper co-authored with Stephanie Gambert, a PhD student also in our university, and Ville Valovirta from the Technical Research Institute of Finland, the VTT. And basically, we address one of the problems that not only happens in the world of procurement. We focus on in innovation procurement in particular, but we have also identified that the same problem happens with other R&D or technology-related policy instruments, and it's a matter of the capabilities, which are the capabilities needed to roll out innovation policies. So the paper, our research, lies in the juncture between mission-oriented innovation policies on the one hand and innovation procurement on the other hand. We know from the literature that mission-oriented innovation policies are here to address societal challenges and societal needs, and in this regard, governments, to address these needs, they need to innovate. We need to set out policies and projects or initiatives that facilitate, that foster innovation, because the challenges that we have, they are known, but the solutions to these challenges are unknown. So on the one hand, mission-oriented innovation policy tells us that there is a need to innovate. On the other hand, one of the instruments that we have to articulate this innovation policy is public procurement. And in the field of public procurement as well, there have been extensive contributions since the last, in the last 25 years, that particularly deal with this problem. How public procurement can be one of the instruments that can facilitate a response, that can provide a response to these societal grand challenges. And one of the elements that makes innovation procurement be distinctive from regular procurement is that in regular procurement, we are buying things, as we call them, off the shelf. The product already exists, we go to the market and we buy it, so the risk is basically non-existent because the product is there. So it's just a matter of using the purchasing power of the public administration, of the governments, to buy those products. But when we are dealing with innovation procurement, as we just said, we know the problem, but there is not a solution which addresses that problem, so we are going to buy something that does not exist. And therefore, managing the risk is one of the key elements that we need to consider in rolling out these innovation procurements. When we go a little bit deeper into what has been happening in the field of procurement itself, 2014 sets a major milestone because the directives that rule procurement in the European Union changed as compared to the directives that we had until then, which were set up in 2004. And in these 2014 directives, they introduced a couple of elements that facilitate the innovation outcomes from public procurement. So the way the directives allow procurement agencies or purchasing authorities to actually conduct the purchasing itself are a bit more flexible. So, for example, they facilitate the constant communication with the potential supplier, something that was not existing in the previous directives. One of the novelties that he also introduced is what we call the functional requirements, the functional specifications. Until then, the specifications that you set out in the procurement call had to be done in a technical way, so you needed to describe the technical characteristics of the product. But, well, many policymakers and many purchasers had the problem, if the product doesn't exist, how can I write the technical specificities? I rather identify which are the needs that eventual product will have to satisfy and tell which are those functions. So setting these functional requirements, introducing these potential to introduce functional requirements into the procurement calls was also a milestone that facilitates the eventual outcome in terms of innovation from the procurement calls. At the same time, this started happening in practice, but at the same time, in theory, we're having very similar discussions, and myself, together with some of the co-authors, we wrote a paper in which we were calling for functional specifications. How defining the problem, those grand challenges that we just mentioned, into functional terms could facilitate, could open the floor for creativity among suppliers, so we could have different alternatives that could provide a solution to the same challenge itself. So in this case, in this paper in particular, what we focus on is on addressing which are the capabilities that we need to actually achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve with public procurements. As we'll see later, in our research, we end up with an identification of 3 different types of capabilities, which we call ordinary, dynamic, and functional. I'll come back to that in a second. The results from our research come from a project that we conducted together with the European Commission in years 2017 and 18. And this project was called a mutual learning exercise on innovation procurement. And in this project participated 15 of the state procurement agencies of 15 European countries. So over the course of a year and a half, we could work together with them, not only in the identification of the capabilities, but also, for example, on the evaluation of the procurement calls or the definition of the tenders, the procedures that they need to follow, and how they implement those procedures, etc. But in this case, I'll focus on the results that we got from the identification of the capabilities. So all in all, and to summarize the results that we got from this mutual learning exercise, we observed that generally speaking, the procurement process could be split into 4 major stages, which go, as you can see, from the clarification of those needs, which are the needs that we want to address, which are the societal needs that actually are of relevance for us, until the development of the eventual solution and the implementation at the societal level. And in rolling out each of these activities, we came across that there are some problems, so that the state procurement agencies of these 15 countries were facing some problems to which they didn't have a clear solution. And as we can see here, in the first stage, we observed that most of the procurement agencies, they have a tendency to prescribe the technical solutions. I have a problem related to the environment, and therefore I want to introduce this particular technology, because the technology exists, but maybe that technology is not the best solution to the problem that we are addressing. But when you already introduce the technical specificities, you are closing the doors for many other eventual solutions to actually start bidding, or for any other potential bidders to apply for that particular matter. The second one, which is partially mitigated by the directives, but still in practice it was not happening, was the need to establish competitive dialogues with the potential bidders. As we said from the beginning, when we are dealing with innovation procurement, we are going to buy things that do not exist and that the eventual suppliers will have to develop. And therefore, it's important, as in any open innovation project, to have a constant communication between the producer and the buyer, in this case the procurement agency. And within the directives, there are a set of procedures that facilitate this, but however, governments, the public administrations, the state procurement agencies had the feeling that they were violating the law if they were establishing a communication, a dialogue with the potential partners. This links, of course, with the third stage, with the execution of the procurement process itself, and it's a lack of interaction with procurement organizations now from the side of the suppliers in many cases, because they thought that if I don't tell which are the specificities of my idea, then probably I can sell to different public administrations. So for example, in this case, bundling the demand, when the same technology can address different needs by different ministries, was becoming relevant. And finally, we'll be dealing with the evaluations. How do we evaluate ex ante a product that does not exist? And how can we know if an innovation that can be very promising can actually address the needs that we have mentioned right from the start? So we define some functional requirements at the beginning. How do we develop those functional evaluation criteria? So in order to address this gap, as we have mentioned earlier, to identify the capabilities, we split the what we call the capabilities roulette. We identify a set of capabilities in the context of the presentation today. I cannot mention all of them, but there were about 45 capabilities that we identified. And we group them into three different sets of capabilities, as I mentioned earlier: the ordinary, the dynamic, and the functional. The ordinary capabilities and the dynamic capabilities come from a seminal paper written by Professor David Tees, in which he was arguing that ordinary capabilities are doing the things right, and dynamic capabilities are doing the right things. And then what we argue with the introduction of the functional capabilities would be that we, at the public administration level in the state procurement agencies, we don't only need to do the right things, we don't only need to do the things right, but we need to do the right things right. So these are what the three inner circles here represent. So these would be the ordinary capabilities, the dynamic capabilities, and the functional capabilities. And each of these inner, triangles would represent each of the capabilities that we have identified. So like in the Russian roulette, you roll out and then you see how each of the capabilities that we identify, sometimes they require some ordinary capabilities, some dynamic capabilities, or some functional capabilities. What we are working on right now is a matter of discussing which is the relative relevance that each of these types of capabilities may have depending on the project that we are addressing. And here we introduce a matrix that comes from a paper that myself wrote with Elvira Viara and some of the colleagues from Manchester, in which we say that we conclude that state procurement agencies or ministries can play 4 different roles when rolling innovation procurement, depending on the agreement that we have on the problem, which are the needs that we have. Sometimes the needs are clearly identified and we agree upon them, and some of the times the demand is not totally articulated and is very fragmented. The different stakeholders at the public or at the private level can have different opinions about it, so that would be one of the axes of the matrix. And the other one would be the consensus that we have about solutions. So we have the problems on the one hand, the agreement that we may have as far as those needs or those challenges are concerned, and then the solutions, which are the innovations that we believe can address those particular needs. And based on this matrix, we addressed, I'm not going into the details today, we addressed that the governments could play 4 different roles: catalyst, lead users, brokers, and purchasers. Okay? So what we argue in this paper, and this is actually a matter of further research, this is what we are doing right now, that depending on the particular role that the state procurement agency may play in each of these cells in the matrix, the relative proportion between the different ordinary, dynamic, and functional capabilities may vary. As you can see in some of the cases, the ordinary capabilities, the green ones, they become the dominant one. In other cases, the functional, they become the dominant one, or the dynamic, etc. So this is actually what we want to identify out of the 45 capabilities that we have identified, depending on the role of the public sector, which might be more relevant to be used. So just to conclude, as we have said, the goal that we started with this project was to identify which are the capacities that we need for innovation procurement to achieve transformative purposes. Transformative being understood as providing a response to the challenges that we as societies are facing at the moment. And we argued that to make innovation procurement work, we need not only ordinary and dynamic capabilities, but also functional capabilities. With this contribution, we believe that we can also help state procurement agencies or ministries to develop their capacity building programs, how they are training their civil servants in order to make innovation procurement a more effective policy instrument. So just jumping into the other areas that we believe could be of relevance for not only for the presentation itself and for our continuation of work, but also for the discussion that we'll have in the next day and a half about the potential utility and the challenges being faced by the innovation and by industrial policy. One of the problems that we are observing when we are implementing innovation procurement is that in many cases, governments have an interest in picking winners. I want this company to actually develop this particular technology for me, and or I want to buy the product of this or this specific company. And here, when we are dealing with innovation procurement, we should instead be picking the willing, picking those companies that want to engage into these uncertain processes where there is a big risk, and to develop a solution that they don't know how it's going to end. So that's one of the one of the areas that we are also digging into about the behavioral real options, which are the real options that are opened with the introduction of an innovation that so far we don't know which can be. So some other additional points for discussion, as we said, that we could have a conversation about during the next days, are how these principles of innovation procurement could be actually also be used for what is being known as the rental economy. Why governments need to buy and own something when instead other actors can also be the owners of that particular good, and then the government can simply rent that particular technology or that particular good. This is something that we believe can be of relevance for industrial policy and for innovation policy as a whole. The second one is related to the public value creation. So, as we have said, functional innovation procurement can be of relevant, but why not extending this functional idea to other policy instruments? For example, by Mariana Mazzucato, they are working on the ideas of functional finance. How can we make finance also respond to the particular challenges that we have? So we believe, and that's something that we want to push in the next years to come, that this functional approach to innovation procurement can also be translated into other policy instruments, as Mazzucato and other colleagues are doing. And the final area that we believe can be of relevance can be how to use innovation procurement also for new market formation. It's not only for addressing those grand challenges, but also to create new markets that do not exist. So yes, potential areas for discussion during the next couple of days. So well, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to be here with all of you today.
Jean-Michel, thank you. That was absolutely great. A lot of people talk about the importance of procurement in industrial policy, but very few people go on to say how you should do it. So this is just the job. We've time for one or two questions. Yeah.
I understand that the innovation you're talking about are mostly technological innovation. Is there also to be procurement for non-technological innovation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. There is a big discussion about social innovations, and I was before we started with the presentation, I was talking to Henry about some of the experiences that we have identified in these particular regards, and it's how to use innovation to address societal purposes. And one of the projects that we saw, just as an illustration of this, was undertaken by the city of Vienna, and how they want to provide some financial assets to people who are homeless, people who don't have an ID, people who don't have a bank account, people who don't have a place where to stay. And in this case, well, the innovation has a clear societal purpose, but the means to develop that particular service, let's say, has a clear technological component. So they were mixing different types of technologies. So in innovation procurement, the goal is not to develop new technologies, is to address a particular societal problem. We have a market that needs to be satisfied by the use of a product or a platform or a service, etc. And what we observe is that in most of these cases, to develop that market, to provide a solution to that particular problem, we need maybe not to develop a new technology from scratch, but we need to use some of the technologies that exist and adapt them to a particular circumstance. So yeah, the answer is we don't necessarily need to develop R&D projects per se to develop new technologies. Most of the times the technologies are there, but we need to be able to, state procurement agencies need to be able to identify which is the potential of those technologies and actually translate them to address a particular societal, in this case, a particular societal challenge.
Chris,
thank you.
and then Martin.
How do you encourage commissioners and procurement officers to adopt some of these principles? Because I could see some barriers there in terms of the accounting methods behind it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, a very good question, and not only a risk related to the accounting itself, but also a risk about how you are violating the law, and that you could be taken to court. So this is a big discussion, and there is no easy solution. So what we argue is that the risk that the procurement agency or the different ministries are assuming, it shouldn't be assumed by the civil servants themselves. It should be assumed by the ministry or by the political, by the person who has a political mandate on that particular unit, because it's true we are playing with public funds, and we we have also identified in many cases the final outcome of the procurement itself is not satisfactory. It doesn't actually comply with the functions that we wanted it to comply with. It's not providing a response to the problem. And how do you communicate that to society, that we have invested whatever amount of millions of pounds or euro to have a product that actually is not satisfying enough? So not only to the media critique, but also to the political influence that it may have for elections and so on. So we don't have a solution for that. The only way that we can observe that it could be somehow partially mitigated would be by the assumption of the risk by the politicians, not by we usually distinguish between a politician and a policymaker. So the politicians we all know, but the policymakers usually we don't know, they are civil servants, so that the risk shouldn't be assumed by the civil servant itself, by the policymaker, but rather by the politicians, because they are subject to the election cycles, while the policymakers, the civil servants itself, they will continue. But it's a very good solution. We don't have an answer to it, not yet.
Last question, Martin.
Yeah. Thank you, John. Very good. I think your focus is on the capabilities of the buying organisation in various forms. How does that relate to the kind of wider institutional failures? Can the buying organisation solve all the problems, or how does that relate to the wider systemic failures?
Well, the reason why we focused on the capabilities of the public sector is because, well, so far in the literature, there's a clear gap that we don't know anything about the capabilities. Everyone talks, well, innovation procurement is not working because of the lack of capabilities, either on the procurer side or on the supplier side, but actually no one has digged into it first. And our decision to focus on the procurer side rather than on the supplier side was driven by the fact that in the literature, some colleagues from Manchester have been doing, which are the barriers perceived by the suppliers, by the supplier organizations, how they observe that the public sector is working, and which are the main barriers, particularly SMEs, that they observe to participate in this type of policy. So we said, okay, let's adopt then a different angle, since no one so far, to the best of our knowledge, has addressed which are the gaps and the systemic problems that we have within the public administration. Let's focus on that particular part. So the barriers are well known. Now it's a matter of what do we do as a public administration to actually mitigate and counterbalance those barriers and to make it work, to make it be more inclusive even for SMEs. So that was our rationale, was driven not that much only by the practice itself, by more what has been happening in academia. So, yeah.
John Michael, thank you very much.
No, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Benoit, please.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yep, great. So, good morning, dear members of the Babbage Forum. To begin, I would like to thank you all for this invitation and this opportunity to present my work. I'm really pleased to be here. So my proposal is named A Process Model for Industrial Innovation Policy when Facing a Paradigmatic Shift. And the research I would like to present here is based on a theoretical work, a theoretical framework I'm building, combining different literature and empirical work I conducted doing case studies in France on the development of additive manufacturing, also called 3D printing, a technology that that was really discussed a lot. So first, I would like to present the theoretical framework. So I'm studying technological change. So I'm building on the literature on technology evolution. And more specifically, I'm working on the DOSIS approach of technological paradigm. Here, the idea is that technology evolves within paradigms, which are defined as clusters of solutions, clusters of technological solutions to a coherent set of similar or related problems. And so these changes are, paradigmatic changes are difficult to handle for companies and also for policymakers. And so this leads me to the second building block, the dynamic capability framework, which is from strategic management. And here, the idea is that facing a paradigmatic shift, companies must integrate, build, reconfigure anew their capabilities. And there is the triptych, which is sensing opportunities, seizing opportunities, and transforming resource and capabilities. So I'm citing the works of David Thies here. And so the idea is to transform the capabilities of the organization facing a technological change. And here, because integrating new capabilities, specifically when they are tacit or when they are really related to organizational process, it could be difficult for an organization. And this is where a relational strategies, a cooperative strategy, can be a path to develop new capabilities. The literature on cooperative strategy is really abundant. We can cite the literature on alliances, the open innovation literature, the literature on ecosystems. So there are a lot of things. But here the gap that we identify is that these literature do not precisely address the question of how these relations, how these interfirms relations are influencing the development of the paradigm. So basically, we are drawing another arrow here from the relational strategies to the development of the technological paradigm. There is the contributions that we can find in this literature dealing with the topic of their role in the development of the technological paradigm are pointing towards a process which is kind of a linear funneling process where we start with the general, where relational strategies are explorative, involve really generic knowledge about the technology, are non-pecuniary, so there are no financial exchanges in these relations, and they are taking place in informal networking settings. And then, when the uncertainty of around the paradigm decline, so it's later in the innovation process or it's later in the technology life cycle, cooperative strategies are moving towards exploitation, toward the involvement of more precise knowledge, toward pecuniary exchanges, and toward the involvement of selected partners and more formal cooperations. And the process that I observed in my empirical work shows that the role that cooperative strategies are playing in the development of the technological paradigm are not following such a process like that. So I will present you the process model that I would like to propose, but before that, I would like to precise a concept which is central to the model that I propose, which is the concept of a modality. And I think that this concept of a modality is really useful to better understand the topics that we are discussing here. The idea of modality, well, as I already said, paradigms are clusters of technological solutions dedicated to a set of consistent or coherent needs. And within a paradigm, the idea of a modality is a distinct technological solution fitting to a distinct problem within a specific industry. So an example could be looking at the 3D printing paradigm. The 3D printing is a very broad set of technologies and problems to solve. And within this paradigm, a modality could be, for example, the tire company Michelin is using powder bed fusion additive metal manufacturing, which is a precise additive manufacturing process among the 7 processes that are usually identified. And they are using this technology to produce complex small shapes that are needed to manufacture tires with tread patterns that were previously impossible to produce with conventional or traditional methods. So this is an example of a modality, a precise technology, a precise problem to solve in a specific industry. And I mobilize this concept of modality in the analysis of the inter-firm relations that are playing a role in the development of the technological paradigm. So the process begins with the emergence of its initial constituents that are unresolved needs and technological solutions that are meeting, that are providing solutions to these needs. And these constituents have a certain visibility. And this visibility dimension will play a key role. In the process that I observed, the existence of these elements triggers the identification of opportunities for the use of additive manufacturing to meet specific needs. So here, the modality, one technology, one application in one industry, is very precise, is very stabilized, and is very clear from the beginning. The relations are taking place in transactional relationships that allow firms to exploit the new process in traditional supplier-customer transactional relations. And this is the moment when, this type of relations is triggering strategic reconfigurations in the value chain, so the typical strategic or competitive effect of technological innovation. And this corresponds, if we are using the David Thies framework, this corresponds to the reconfiguring dynamic capability, but at the macro, at the level of the value chain or the value network, and not at the only level of the firm. And this type of relations triggers a feedback loop that increases the visibility of the paradigm. And this is at this moment that, when some transactional relationships are developed, the visibility of the paradigm becomes important. The paradigm, the technology, arouses interest. And this is where what we call, this is the second type of inter-firm relations, this is where what we call networking clubs are formed. And here in these networking clubs, actors are learning from each other, developing a common understanding, a shared technological framework around the technology. They are also thinking about their own strategy. But in these clubs, many situations can be discussed. And here the modality is unclear because people are discussing additive manufacturing, for example, with metal, with plastic, or with ceramic for different uses in different industries. So here, the modality is not clear and not defined yet, and this corresponds at the collective level to the sensing dynamic capability. These networking clubs are not directly leading to the emergence of concrete implementation in transactional relationships, but they contribute to the visibility of the paradigm and basically the general culture around the technology. Once some potential modalities have begun to emerge, we are observing the third type of inter-firm relations. And more exploration is still needed to explore the modality. And here, the idea is to test possible matches between needs, problem to be solved, and a technological solution. So it's really the step where companies are pairing technology and needs. And this is typically done in dyadic alliances, so relation with two partners where each are bringing their specific capabilities. Here, it's not about discovering the general idea and the general paradigm. The idea is to develop the relevant modalities. So this is also where the relations are making creating the technological trajectory. But we are not yet at the stage of strategic reconfiguration, as in the transactional relationships. We are getting closer to this stage, but we are not yet at this stage, and this corresponds to the seizing dynamic capabilities and also triggering a feedback loop that increases the visibility of the paradigm and fosters the development of transactional relationships. So in a synthesis, we observed 3 types of interfirm relations that helps companies to explore the new paradigm. So they can explore a wide range of modalities in networking club, a more circumscribed range of modalities in dyadic alliance, or a really precise range of modalities in transactional relations. And these relations enables the exploration of the technological paradigm, and in doing so, they contribute to shape the technological trajectories within that are created within the paradigm. So the fact that we can observe that the relations evolve with the modality that are at stake shows the role they are playing in the development of new trajectories. These 3 types of relations correspond to the implementation of the 3 dynamic capabilities of the TIS framework, but we are moving these capabilities that were at the beginning, the idea is that it was capabilities for companies, and we are moving them at a more macro, at a more meta level. So it's sensing with networks, seizing with dyadic alliances, and transforming and reconfiguring in transactional relationships. However, compared to what I discussed earlier, we can see that these relations are not following kind of a funneling linear process, as I presented earlier, from the most general to the most specific, or from search to the market. Here, the process that we observe is that they rather start with transactional relationships on a very precise modality, and then these transactional relationships are feeding feedback loops, which are feeding the other interfirm relations, where a broader range of modalities are at stake, so and then can be discussed and can be developed, and this is what is developing new technological trajectories. It must also be noted that actors, companies, can enter into this game at their own time and via market relationships, dyadic alliance, or networking clubs, and it depends on their context and their objectives, and they can even get in the new paradigm using different types of relation at the same time. And we believe that this, this was the idea. We believe that this framework may provide some guidance to policymakers, because we think that fostering interfirm relations is a way, can be in itself an innovation strategy, and having this sort of guidance in the role of different relations could be useful. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Great, thank you, Benoit. I think that business of taking something which is focused at the company level and moving it up to the higher system level is great. Questions or comments, please? Martin, clear.
Thank you. I'm interested particularly in the clubs, the networking clubs. How formally constituted are they in terms of what the deal is for the participants and how much IP is to be shared and that kind of thing? I'm thinking of capital.
These networking clubs, just for the context, I observed them. I observed the one in France. In France, it's a part of the Alliance for the Industry of the Future. And there is a specific group within this broad alliance. There is a specific group about 3D printing. We observed some very similar things in the UK, and I was working with, I discussed that a lot with Tim Minshall during my PhD, because the clubs, basically the way it was working was very similar. Well, in both cases, the decision was made to get the club open for every participant. It was free to participate, and it was not presented in both situations as well. It was not presenting as, hey, we have a very nice club, please come on and let's network together. It was presented as, okay, let's think about a national strategy for 3D printing. But at the end of the day, when you are looking at what is within these national strategies for 3D printing, it's not a national strategy, because strategic management is about making choice, okay, making choices. Here it was more like a big list where every participant was able to mention its own questions and its own issue. So it was not really a strategy. It was more like a catalog, I would say. But it was useful in both situations. It was useful because it was the places where people were meeting and companies interested in the technology were meeting and were able to discuss, you're doing that, oh, I'm doing this. And it was really like about collective learning and sharing informations. And so I hope it answers the question. It answers the question.
Can I ask, because this is a really interesting example, because the MTC, as pointed out, we're very much involved with additive manufacture. We have where you say club, I think we call it a membership model, but I don't think there's much difference there. How do you see this as those clubs forming the basis of a cluster? And do you see this being replicated in other technologies?
Well, I just to clarify, if I understand well your question, there is some. I think that there is some memberships and where like clubs are not so open as what I described. It was more open when, like, typically people from universities were inviting every participant in the same room to discuss. And here it is what I call the open club. But of course, for example, the Alliance for the Industry of the Future was also involving a membership, and it was not open to everyone. And is it replicable? This is a very, well, this is the $1 million question, of course. I think that, well, I observed some similarities with other technologies. For example, if you look at artificial intelligence, which was also a big thing, a big new technological paradigm. In France, we had, well, we also had this exercise of writing a national strategy. If you look at the strategy, basically it's very similar with the 3D printing strategy, but you just cut 3D printing, replaces it with artificial intelligence, and basically it's almost the same thing. And the moment of collective thinking was sharing, like a moment where people were really meeting together and discussing. So I don't know if it's replicable, but I observed similar patterns. I think in the specific case of additive manufacturing, one of the very, like in the very nature of the technology, it was really a solution looking for problems to solve. And this nature was making, well, was probably a source for the process I observed. Was probably a reason for this process. Yeah.
If there are no more questions, shall we move on? Sure. Benoit, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Henry, welcome.
Okay. So I'm here to talk about using industrial policy to promote interdisciplinarity in academia. And I propose two different kind of illustrative programs, the Atlas Institute and Academic Reserve, as some ways potentially that we could do that. First of all, also I'd love to thank everybody for having me, of course, and for the opportunity. Definitely don't want to forget that. I'll first kind of motivate kind of the problem and potentially the relationship between industrial policy and interdisciplinarity. Compared to the past two talks, I think it might be a little bit light on the industrial policy side, but actually, as I was listening to those, it was interesting because I think maybe there's some opportunity here to, almost operationalize some of the relationships that Benoit had identified in some of kind of these kind of tenuous links for me across disciplines, for Benoit across different kinds of companies and different capabilities, and then almost to bring those into government to do some of the evaluation that Jean-Michel was mentioning around kind of procurement. So maybe that's one entree in particular into really kind of how we could help kind of industrial policy formation and procurement today. But again, I'll motivate the problem a little bit and then talk about these two illustrative programs in particular. So the main problem is basically that scholars and policymakers are frequently calling for increased interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary education. It was actually almost even some of the prompt of the call that we had, the use of interdisciplinary approaches in industrial policy formation. But in we see that these in practice, these approaches are consistently underutilized, and I'm just trying to think a little bit about why and how to fix that. So what do I mean by underutilized? Well, we see in research that there's still a relatively, even despite kind of these calls, especially I think in the past 10 or 20 years, there's not too much change of the use of interdisciplinarity, both in the natural sciences and the social sciences, maybe a little bit more in the social sciences at about 50% of papers that use references to other disciplines. But even though there's this slight uptick, and maybe that 50% number for some seems high, for some seems low, we see that it's very different across fields. And in particular, a couple of the things that I wanted to highlight was economics, one field that's social science and that has considerable impact on public policy. We see is very low on the interdisciplinarity, and clinical medicine, despite a lot of the health services and some of the underlying hard sciences, around biology and chemistry being kind of closely linked, we see clinical medicine also relatively low on there. So I find that kind of interesting that even in these areas where we expect interdisciplinarity to be somewhat high, we still kind of don't see it in practice. This is also true not only in academia but also in public policy. Here we have a graph of the trends of citations, or I should say not citations, but the times that a particular discipline is referenced in the New York Times, for example, if they quote or if they interview an expert in a particular domain. We see that there's a peak of economists. The question actually in this article from 2015 was whether we've reached peak economists. I think just in terms of anecdotal experience since then, my experience is that the answer is probably no. But in public policy, even though you could obviously, I believe, see a call for sociology around inequalities, or around anthropologists for lived experience of public policies in practice, we don't see that coming out obviously in the public policy debate. Why is that? Well, the question for me really comes down to what interdisciplinarity is, and we see here that it's actually relatively complex. This is a definition that was proposed in 2007. We see that it's sort of a functional definition around around integrating two or more distinct scientific disciplines, around linking those theoretical frameworks, around using a study design and methodology that's not linked to any one of those particular fields, and around incorporating the uses of both the perspectives and skills of those involved disciplines. And I think in all of our experiences, academics, that's probably a lot harder to do than it is to sort of put on paper, particularly because academic disciplines shift. These aren't static kind of disciplines. The way that a particular discipline might use a particular theoretical framework obviously moves over time. They're using different epistemological modes. It's very difficult to link somebody from, difficult to link in practice those study design and methodology when one is coming from a very positivist mode and the other from a very interpretivist mode. And then obviously also in academia, I think a lot of us have probably experienced that there are organizational, practical, and especially incentive barriers to overcome, and my focus was around how to do that. So my paper examines the relationship between, again, interdisciplinarity and industrial policy, and I look at sort of this relationship in both directions. Interdisciplinarity as the outcome of industrial policy, and this might be sort of a little bit of why is interdisciplinarity important, not just in Cambridge, the UK, but in centers of government and whatnot, because interdisciplinary approaches are particularly well suited to wicked problems that draw from different fields, that draw from different perspectives and are defined in a way that no one domain really has kind of a singular vision over. And also for responsible research and innovation, which I would argue is the target of many industrial policy initiatives, particularly in the UK, particularly in recent years around, for example, mission-oriented innovation that, as John Michael noted before around, Mariana Mazzucato's work and whatnot. So interdisciplinary is the outcome of industrial policy, but also as an input to industrial policy, both as in terms of evidence-based policymaking. So again, coming back to that question of economists versus sociologists versus anthropologists, how to form what kinds of evidence are incorporated in a particular industrial policy strategy or vision or decision, but also, so that's, I would say, explicitly in terms of incorporating that evidence, and then also implicitly in terms of the education of policymakers and policy analysts that are helping to form those decisions. So those are the two kinds of levers and approaches that I'm looking to target with the two illustrative programs that I'm going to propose. So here we have just a little bit about some of these barriers that I mentioned earlier to interdisciplinarity. The first is, again, kind of this relatively ambiguous definition, such that it's very difficult to specify what competencies are necessary, what competencies among interdisciplinary scholars, but also what types of structures and resources among interdisciplinary, for example, institutions would be necessary to bring about true interdisciplinary research, for example, according to the definition that we proposed before. There's less funding, despite funders stating that they're looking, less funding for interdisciplinary research relative to other types of research, despite funders and policymakers' stated goals. It's obviously disincentivized by academic metrics, norms, and structures, for example, publishing in journals that are particularly domain or method specific. And it's difficult to implement even when those types of structures are in place. So here I cited, for example, just two initiatives, one that I'm particularly familiar with, the Engineering Systems Division at MIT, where I graduated from, and that no longer exists, and the MIT Cambridge initiative, which I'm only familiar with indirectly, but I'm sure also folks from the room are a little bit more familiar with, which was initially kind of an industrial policy, primarily an industrial policy initiative around bringing together academics, corporate structures, and folks around specific, technological domains, similar almost, I believe, to how the catapults operate, and those, but those have been maybe slightly more successful in recent years, but ultimately kind of wound up being more of a mechanism for education across MIT and in Cambridge, as I'm familiar with it, but which is obviously still valuable, but indicates how difficult it is to really do interdisciplinary education or interdisciplinary approaches well, and also collaboration of interdisciplinary faculty, and this speaks again to that point earlier about norms and incentives across different disciplines. So that looked in one direction around challenges of interdisciplinarity, and I'm still looking in this direction and looking at how interdisciplinary industrial policy stimulates or could stimulate interdisciplinarity. The first is as an input, so in terms of developing generative technologies as a stimulus. And here I just pulled this from a National Academies of Science report from 2005 that was particularly focused on, for example, used as a case the microscope, which is a generative technology that was a stimulus then for interdisciplinary work in the sciences. And they were looking for, and they were using this example to promote the use of cyber infrastructure in a similar way. This was in 2005, and I think we've seen that to a great degree since then. Had a specific funding initiative around that, around knowledge and distributed intelligence, and we're seeing that grow to the extent today, actually, where we could argue that that actually is now its own discipline. And then also the ARPA model, ARIA, the catapults, as we sort of talked about earlier. So that's as an input into interdisciplinarity, and then as an output in terms of creating demand. And so here I'm thinking in particular of initiatives around responsible research and innovation, around engineering and policy education, similar to, for example, the Engineering Systems Division, and in terms of, for example, thinking about the how to influence, for example, the curricula in engineering to incorporate some of these other aspects around, for example, ethical AI and whatnot. So that's in the one direction. Now I'm looking in the other direction about how interdisciplinarity can strengthen industrial policy. First is that we see continued limits of a single discipline or economically driven approaches, or primarily economically driven approaches in industrial policy. It was the prompt of the essay contest, so I don't know that I necessarily need to convince anybody in the room. But we also see consistent underrepresentation of STEM and civil services, and this I think is the link to John Mikel's paper, where there's a question of, well, how do we evaluate these types of innovations that we may be trying to procure for, particularly when they're uncertain and particularly when, for example, before they exist. Some of the questions of, well, what are some of the mechanisms by which these single discipline approaches may occur? One is, for example, stakeholder salience that I tried to draw from, which is the impact of power, legitimacy, and urgency on a particular policymaker or decision maker's attention or their attention to particular stakeholders. And this comes back potentially to that economic question. Perhaps we've focused on the legitimacy of economists outsized relative to other types of disciplines. And I'm trying to think about how to incorporate other types of disciplines in a more systematic way. And even within academic disciplines, we have a question of dominance of prevailing theory, such that it's very difficult to get at other types or lend legitimacy to other types of theories or solutions. And then here, just drawing a little bit again from some of the types of literature that some of the other presenters have spoken about, but what role for interdisciplinarity in industrial policy? Basically, the argument that if industrial policy is around the development of targeted interventions for for market design, as opposed to simply facilitating markets in a laissez-faire fashion, well, then there's been plenty of, I would say, arguments that have done much stronger than I around why it's so important to incorporate those other perspectives, other metrics, and other values into the formation of industrial policy. So the two programs that I propose to address this challenge, first is the Atlas Institute, which I view as a research center that would study interdisciplinary research at the meta level. So it would do a couple different things. First, it would do methods development. So it would develop and systematize the knowledge management tools and methods to effectively identify research trends across scientific disciplines and do the work to disseminate those research methods across disciplines. So here we'd be looking not about specific methods in a specific discipline, but about the methods for doing interdisciplinary research at the meta level. It would also do theory, so it would do theory and knowledge generation. It would also evaluate the interdisciplinary research institutes that we see cropping up, and even, I might argue some of the interdisciplinary approaches, for example, catapult centers and whatnot, to identify essentially what works in these areas. So, we see a lot of institutes that have been developed, so for example, Turing Institute or catapult centers and whatnot, directly around the idea of bringing together folks from different disciplines to do applied research, but not a lot of, I would argue, knowledge generation, and particularly applied knowledge generation, to use the insights from any of those particular centers to do work across, or to open similar centers in other areas. And this might come back again to sort of the point I made earlier about Benoit's research, how to systematize some of those types of networking clubs and processes to draw those insights across different areas of application. And then again, it would do some very targeted advising, training, and kind of best practice generation and dissemination work to actually come into government and advise on the development and organization of those types of centers. Secondly, I propose the academic reserve, or maybe more generally the innovators reserve, to also incorporate, for example, engineers from private practice. But I view the academic, so I propose the academic reserve as a public sector institution that would place academic researchers or other types of innovators, engineers, and whatnot on call for policy and practice impact. So this would look similar to a military reserve, for example, where we see a set of reservists that have a primary function. Here it would be in academia or in their main companies. And they would maintain those primary affiliations, but they get called on an occasional basis to do very targeted interventions in the military case, obviously in military, but in my example, to respond to specific public policy needs. For example, with respect to John McGill's research, to inform on a large-scale procurement initiative around a particular innovation that, for example, maybe we don't know how to specify competencies for. So they could do, essentially what they do best, the modeling and research around a particular area, bringing in expertise, but in a more flexible way, both for the civil service and also for academia. And the key aspect of this program, as opposed to one-off ad hoc types of relationships that may be built across, to advise governments or to advise other types of organizations, would be a sort of a recognized validation and reward system for high-quality contributions, similar to what you have in a reservist system in the military, where you have different types, where you have obviously promotion and different organizational structures. Here you would have something similar, where you'd have promotion and recognition for valid contributions to practice in an interdisciplinary, problem-oriented type of project that traditionally in academia is very difficult to incentivize. So just to wrap up, again, there's a stated desire for both interdisciplinarity and pro-social innovation in industrial policy, but consistent under provision of both. These programs are highly illustrative. I don't think that either of these programs should be put into place the way that I have just presented, particularly in the amount of time that I've just presented. These obviously would need to be thought about and probably implemented in a much more nuanced way. But they just demonstrate some operational mechanisms to overcome some of these persistent barriers to interdisciplinarity. And again, I'm looking at sort of two approaches relative to industrial policy. The Atlas Institute would help advise governments on the how-to of industrial policy, what it means to bring, and how effectively to bring together perspectives from across the different disciplines. And then the Academic Reserve as the lever that they could pull to start to do some of these, the lever that they could pull, and particularly the flexible resource that they could use to start to do some of these initiatives in practice. Here I just talk about some of the contributions, but I think I've discussed those kind of in depth, so I'd be happy to sort of talk about questions instead, but I'll leave these up.
Henry, thank you very much. I mean, great to have some practical suggestions on how to do these things and lots to chew on. I suggest that we don't do questions now, but we want a longer conversation about this over the next day or so. So a great idea, great ideas, practical proposals, and lots to chew on how we might adopt some of them. And also great to see you referencing Liz Killen's work on the slide. We definitely appreciate that.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much, everyone.
Anais, welcome. How do we pronounce that?
Anais.
Anais.
Yes.
Great.
So thank you very much for having me here, giving me the opportunity to present my paper. So I co-wrote that paper with Mathias Béjean, who's very sorry to not be here today, but he would like to thank you all as well. And we'll present their paper, which is Orchestrating the MedTech Industry, New Frameworks, Tools and Rules for Effective Policymaking. So just to give you a little bit of context, the medtech industry is very innovative with a lot of medical technologies, but it's also very fragmented. So we have several small and medium enterprises that are spread and that do not necessarily collaborate. But recently what we see is that several different small and medium enterprises will gather and will work together, and they will form clusters or ecosystems in order to face the challenges in the environment. Because in the medtech industry, firms face strict regulations, of course, because it's about technologies for the health of people, so they have to respect strict regulations, and they also face limited public healthcare budgets. So by working together, they can share their knowledge, they can share their expertise, and they can face those barriers from the industry. So in this industry, regulators and policymakers have a role. They have an influence on the innovative capabilities and resources of those firms. They are the ones that establish the strict regulatory processes. For example, in France recently we have a new policy on activity-based pricing, and it has threatened the innovative capabilities of some healthcare companies. And they also have a crucial role in drawing the future of this industry, in encouraging patients' integration, which is really important. I will mention that again in a bit. And they also have a crucial role in creating the appropriate innovations. So as I said, the challenges, medtech innovations have to pass a strict regulatory checks. They have to respect some criteria before going to market. So many innovations first do not pass that regulatory check, and if they do, they might fail to find a market because patients, users, professionals are not always integrated in the innovation process. And this is very important, because if we don't consider the perception of users, then indeed the innovation may be out here, but no one will really want it, or it's maybe not adapted to what patients need. So it's very important to include the users, and it's important because those innovations can also transform professional practices. It can alter the relationships between the health professionals and the patients in terms of support that is given and in terms of considering the expertise that the patients have on their own situation. So that lack of patient integration may weaken our understanding of how innovations is used in real life, and therefore it weakens their desirability and global accessibility. So this collaborative system in the medtech industry is unstructured, at least in Europe, and we need to have technologies, innovations that are better adapted and more socially valued by the patients and the users. And for that, we do need to empower patients and health professionals to create relevant social innovations. So traditionally, to structure innovations, policymakers have looked at different concepts such as innovation districts or national or regional innovation systems, and later on clusters were introduced. But more recently, we have the concept of ecosystems that have been introduced in 1993 by Moore. And more specifically, innovation ecosystems were defined by Adner recently as collaborative arrangements through which firms combine their individual offerings into a coherent and customer-facing solution. So we have several things that gather. They collaborate, but they also compete together to co-create value that are relevant for the user. So that concept of ecosystem is relevant in the medtech industry because it enables the inclusion of patients. They are very heterogeneous compared to other type of networks, so we find firms, but also research institutes, governments, and the users. They're also very dynamic because different actors can enter that ecosystem, exit the ecosystem, but they can also change roles within the ecosystem. So they're very dynamic, they evolve. The life cycle of ecosystem has been introduced with a phase of emergence, development, and renewal. What is interesting in ecosystems is that we do not find a focal firm or hierarchical governance mechanism to coordinate those ecosystems. And we can describe ecosystem through three coordinating principles through community, market, and hierarchy, and I will also mention that later again. So to coordinate innovation ecosystems, it's difficult because of that heterogeneous nature. We have several actors, so they have different knowledge, different values, different norms, and therefore also different interests. So it's very difficult for a single actor, for a focal firm, to manage such diversity of competence and to gain authority and control over that ecosystem. So one way to see it, to coordinate innovation ecosystem, is by balancing those three coordinating principles, which are community, market, and hierarchy. So with community, community relies on trust, and it's here to stimulate knowledge sharing and innovation. Market, on the other side, will rely on prices, and it's here to ensure the openness and flexibility of the network. And hierarchy is more here to control and regulate behaviors. In the literature, what we have is that we lack insights on how this coordination is achieved. And what are the guidelines for policymakers to regulate innovation ecosystems. And one concept that has been introduced to deal with this is the concept of ecosystem orchestration. So orchestration was defined as a way to coordinate ecosystem and as a way to maintain them over time. Past research studied orchestrators, so the actors that carry out that orchestration, also some of their capabilities, and some activities were also identified. What we suggest is that it can be a way to balance that community, market, and hierarchy principles. And in practice with orchestration, we do not have one focal firm. When the concept was first introduced, it was said that it was the orchestrator, implying that there would be only one. But more recent research showed that orchestration can be spread. So several actors may have be responsible for different orchestration activities. And what is also interesting is that here we find again the dynamic side, because one actor may be responsible for one orchestration activity at a time, but as the ecosystem evolves, it can take on another type of orchestration activity. And in the medtech, that orchestration can be shared between policymakers, firms, and patients, for example, and that could be an interesting way to balance those dynamics. So policymakers would be here to ensure maybe more the hierarchy principle with control and policies. Firms and patients association could be here to balance with more the community and market principles. And so the national literature on the orchestration of innovation ecosystem provides some insights on how coordination takes place without a single firm, but we still need to understand how those ecosystems achieve coordination between actors that can also evolve and change roles as the ecosystem evolves. And so my PhD project is part of a larger multidisciplinary research project called d'Insanté. So santé means health in French, so that's really working in the medtech industry. And with that project, the goal is to first explore those challenges that I mentioned in medtech industry, but also to develop tools to have more inclusive ecosystems in the medtech industry. So really, the integration of users is really central in that project. And we aim at studying the role, the characteristics, and the activities of orchestrating actors in achieving this integrative, inclusive ecosystem. In terms of research field, we have identified several innovation ecosystems in France. So we have one in the west, the east, and the south. And for my PhD project today, we'll focus on the HIT ecosystem. So the HIT means Handicap Innovation Territoire. So it's for a disability innovation territory. This is the main case study of my PhD, and this project was founded by 4 actors in 2017. They answered a national call for project, and then later they were rewarded, and they started to gather several actors around that project. So now they have about 100 partners around them, and they defined about 60 operations to carry out that project. They benefited from several grants that amount to 14 million euros. And then recently, as the project was launched, they thought we need to structure that ecosystem. Now it's great, we have lots of partners around us, but we need to structure that. And so they created a new company, Cowork Hit. And that company was created to structure the ecosystem, so it was created as the orchestrator. But what I noticed in my research is that it is the main orchestrator, but other actors are actually also involved in coordinating that ecosystem. This is not the only one. It's not in charge of everything. So with that research, we suggest that policymakers may benefit from working with this orchestrator because orchestrators have the legitimacy on their ecosystem. They also have power and the authority on other actors. And so they could maybe balance the control of policymakers and also extend their influence within ecosystem. Our research may help policymakers to better regulate innovation ecosystem by providing them a better understanding of what ecosystems are and who are the orchestrators. We can also give them tools to establish policies that are relevant to foster the emergence of orchestrators, and therefore this will improve the coordination and performance of innovation ecosystems. The research could also influence many actions of policymakers on medical technologies in general, and to therefore foster innovative technologies. We could also see several implications along the ecosystem life cycle. So, for example, at the emergence of the ecosystem, we need to promote and to support actors. And here, our research could help policymakers to detect those orchestrators and to favor them in the ecosystem, and therefore to help them support actors. It could also help policymakers to improve the innovation capabilities of ecosystem actors and to collaborate more with patients and society. Then later in the growth stage, what we need is means of control and regulation as the ecosystem grow. So here the research could help policymakers to control innovation, how innovation and coordination take place in the ecosystem, but it could also help them to adjust the regulation and to better understand the orchestrator's role. And then in the last phase, in the renewal upholding phase, we need assessment and renewal. So we need to keep creating value, we need to adapt to maintain the ecosystems, and here means of assessments may become possible. So we could, for example, measure the ecosystem impact on the territory. We could also see the added value of the ecosystems instead of economic and social factors. So overall, the research would offer a better understanding of what is orchestration, how orchestrators coordinate the actors within an ecosystem, and it provides insight on the design, the follow-up, the support, the renewal of innovation ecosystems. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, that's great, thank you. And lots of very practical guidance, I think, for people trying to create these clusters of activity. To an earlier question. Again, I feel we ought to move on, and with apologies to those online, but those of us in the room will have time over the next couple of days to explore some of these ideas.
Yes.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
My name is Xiaohong. It is a great pleasure for this opportunity to present my idea for developing implementable industry innovation policies using a closed-loop supply chain idea to further environmental sustainability. The focus of this particular paper is on a simple methodology. So because what can we implementable, so we need some structure which the methodology come from. So the 4 parts being planned for this presentation. The first one is the concept, to understand the industry innovation policy. Then move on to the methodology proposed is in the later of the paper, but I put in the second part for this talk. Then a bit explanation on the closed-loop material flow and closed-loop supply chains, which I use as a new idea incorporate for the industry innovation policy development to make that relevant. Finally, I add a few more examples for this talk. Some are not on the paper, to emphasize how this in different industry facing different challenges, how industry innovation policy can support environmental sustainability development. So the understanding, because every time when we do things, we have a focus. For this particular focus is on IP industry innovation policies. So this one become important for this particular, the topic exploration. However, make it relevant is we, as operations management perspective, we say products, process, market, demand, tech, Then from another side, we constantly use technology. We need material. And innovation come to a part is new element. So technology, advanced manufacturing technology, for example. Then the material, not just involving, is the revolutionary change of the things we do things. So normally technology and the material integration together is not separate. Separate is not working. Would generate lots of new ideas. How this can impact on the real life manufacturing process, bring the products and services to the market, which require the new management approaches to integrate and which come to the support of the industry innovation policies to linkage these two dimensions. Otherwise, sometimes if middle bit be missing, then the impact on the changing is limited. So I put the first stage, simple methodology. So I'm going to talk from the third one first. Specify means without the specific policies, yeah, whatever they're tailored for a particular industry or for a particular, development, like a 3D printing technology, yeah. So without specification, it's not implementable. Yeah, so far it's very theoretical. Yeah. So if the innovation carries the feature of the new, without frequently review to updating it, then it will be no longer new. So make all this relevant, we need to bring the new idea in at the first stage, but it is a circular methodology. Need to define that new ideas. Today I'm going to use the closed loop material flows, which is the key element for developed closed loop supply chain, as a new idea to explore what we are having now in policy, which might be relevant, might not be enough. So either overlap on the further implication maybe can be further developed. Yeah. So the thinking, I've been last few years from the before 2000, from 2017 something, maybe a little bit early. I was constantly thinking we've been teaching like we've been in practice make decisions. Everything is linear. In order to improve the competitiveness, we're thinking about how can we generate more with reduced input. So we forgot what afterwards. Even now, a lot of policy decided, we're going to have an example come for the one industry I focus on heavily, is afterwards, we're not thinking about all these goods being finished use, what is going to be next. So the moving thinking is from linear to the closed loop, is on the top one, the closed loop, is create another process which generates the materials from maybe end of the life product itself. But of course, the proposed great challenge requires the collaboration. Of course, industry requires the policy setting, strategy setting, and regulation, legislation, all different. The main problem is the moment, if the top one, the closed loop, the top process is much, much smaller than the bottom where we produce the goods services. A lot of leaking to the landfill, and we constantly get more material from natural resources. So the problem is the disposal part, yeah, and the top bit, extracted natural material, still play a significant quantity in the current our industry life linked to our everyday life. Yeah. So the recycling is not new, but everything's come to afterthoughts. It's after things happened. What can we do to recycle this? So much waste in the landfill. What can we do before we handle with that? And remanufacturing and reuse, people will have a first impression. Quality is not up to, I want to buy new ones, because the remanufacturing the goods can have a even superior performance in quality with maybe 1/3 of the cost. The main thing is not ended into landfill, so it's environmental friendly, yeah, totally. If the loop can be much closed, yeah. The challenges in single supply chain, the loop should not be totally closed, should much in the extended system perspective, because one industry, the waste could be a feedstock for another industry. So that will, each party of the supply chain need to collaborate together. The traditional way we see the linear, yeah, supply, even the name, supply chain. Yeah, later on we talk about supply chain network. Now we have a new term, reverse supply chain, but it's not to totally represent the closed material loop indicated by involve the end user. That's the challenge. End user everywhere is not structured as we can collaborate into the material flow into the closed material loop. Yeah. Also, a lot of challenge presented in the systematically collect the waste from the society. Yeah, even we have a lot of recycled bins there, but we know many things is ending in the landfill. Yeah. Then we move on to the examples. I use examples then linking to how this is relevant to the industry innovation policies. Of course, we need a green technology. Yeah, we need a green design. We need different materials. When some is happening because the industry need have a different reputations. So we have this this Adidas trainers use the 3D printing technology. The main important is use the ocean waste to create the eco-friendly. So they close some part of the material loop because they use the ocean waste to become product to re-enter into the the material flow loop. But when these shoes being finished use, we don't know. Then also, what's relevant to industry policy is how industry policy can support this kind of practice. Because one leading company like Adidas, Nike, they have resources to do that. But how the other companies in the industry, how the other industry to consider this type of the technological and material innovation into the market, yeah, to have a environmental sustainability impact. We always thinking solar cell industry. Second example, yeah. Green industry, green energy, green, put lots of on the roof. Yeah, to use a solar panel as an example. We see the top left beautiful solar panel in use. We forgot, look at the second one. This is in the landfill. Then another one, the big field, the wasted solar panels. Even more, they're toxic. Even the technology is recycling technology available to claim is like when they mix everything together, separate glass with other metal and some silicone, two type of the solar panel. This current technology. Silicone, then they call the thin film. The silicone can be recycled back. I just done the for the data collection for different purpose on this. So all the company from the solar panel manufacturing, they refuse to use the recycled material from this because the purity is not up to date. So the burden issues I can give it to other company, other industry, but the main thing is 30 years after huge quantity solar panel on the roof, start from US, followed by other countries, will in the very short period, even now, is facing significant challenge. How this? So how we can learn this from policy perspective? How can we, at the beginning, from the product design stage, we consider ease of the recyclability possibility and the quality of the recycled materials? Yeah. And thirdly, the ecosystem. Yeah, I might also research focus on lots of industry ecology. So ecosystem. Industry symbiosis. Industry symbiosis, how the policy can support the green innovation to use one industry's waste. This is the pharmaceutical industry waste to being treated into the farming industry. There are many, but however, the development of this symbiosis is relatively very slow, yeah, from my perspective. Yeah. So how can industry innovation policy from a green technology, green material revolution, so closed material loop, actually if the plastic stayed in what we use, not go to the ocean, not go to the landfill, plastic is no longer evil because it's leaking out to the other part. If keeping at the material, so will be sustainable, yeah. So come back to, if I propose the first stage of the methodology, so back to the solar cell industry, we'll come to so how can solar cell industry rethinking not just green energy, how can they make the industry truly green by thinking new design, new way to reconsider the ease of the recycling and the quality of the output. Yeah. Then the specify the element which missing in the policy element, then we can constantly update in order to give the closed loop a much more important role in play in our life in industry to make this world a much better place. Yeah. Thank you. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah.
Well, John, thank you very much indeed. I think these are concepts that we all too rarely hear in policy circles, things like symbiosis, closed-loopedness, if that's a real English word, and so on. Lots there to help us over the next couple of days. Thank you so much. I just think we should move on now, keeping an eye on the clock, but we look forward to coming back to some of these very original ideas. Thank you.
Hello. Hi there. Hi everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Adam Mutar, and I'm going to be presenting about the UK's industrial policies, consistency, and coordination challenges. Just a little bit of a correction. Overcoming is a bit of an ambitious thing, so maybe I'll just remove that thing. So it's more of an exploratory analysis to understand the landscape of industrial policy in the UK, because it's a big topic that everyone talks about, but we still don't see the full picture, so to speak, of what this animal is in this country at least. So this is what this whole research idea work is about, to kind of frame and define the contours of what we're actually talking about when we're talking about industrial policy. So a few things. First of all, this is kind of a big topic within academic circles and in policy circles. So first of all, in policy circles, like almost every major advanced country in the world is out there doing it. Japan, China, those classic examples. But also you think about recent examples like the EU, the US. So the US, which is a very unlikely example with their latest Innovation and Competition Act last year that was bipartisan support to support everything from microelectronics to AI to space and everything else. So this is kind of like a big thing that a lot of advanced countries are doing. In academic literature, I've put in a few things here, but these are mostly economic circle academic literatures. But there's also a great recognition of that this is something that's the zeitgeist of the day, and this is something that most people should be looking at. And within the specific economic literature, the exact definitions of industrial policy has kind of like grown beyond what classically is defined, like kind of traditional defensive, protect jobs, kind of like industrial policy, to what Stiglitz calls it learning, industrial and technology policy. I think, Roderick calls it technology and innovation. So these kind of like elements of innovations, and industrial, adaptation and structural upgrading has been incorporated into the industrial policy literature, so to speak. What's also interesting in terms of like the development of the debate in this kind of space, at least within the economic literature, is it's kind of like moved on, relatively speaking, moved on from a more ideological debate, we should, what's the role of state, etc., to the point of, this is what Danny Roderick of Harvard Kennedy said, it's away from the question of why, and it's progressed to the question of how. So like, there is a point where industrial policy can be bad if it's designed badly and it targets poorly, and it can be good if it's designed correctly and with the right appropriate measures, policies, targets, etc. So that's kind of like the progression of the literature. One thing I want to point out is one by CFM, Center for Macroeconomics at LSE, I think. So it's a survey done for most expert economists in the UK, asking whether, this was back in 2017, but it was asking, does the UK need a new industrial policy? And majority of the respondents either agree or strongly agree. So the balance, at least in the academic economic space, is shifting towards supporting some form of industrial policy. So just want to dive into a little bit deeper into this. So some of the economic heavyweights that they've asked, Sir Chris Presidides, Nobel laureate, Silvana Tornero, she's a MPC member at the Bank of England now. I think a lot of them are in agreement, but there's one thing I like to point out. It's not just agreement, blind agreement. There's like a nuanced take to what is agreed. It's also the fact that it's not just industrial policy, yes, it's good, it's the shape of it, this the policy design of that industrial policy. So there's a growing recognition that this is not just industrial policy, how is it designed? That's what fundamentally matters. And you know, I mean, not just to say, just take some views of the dissenters, David Miles of Imperial, Ricardo Rice at LSE. David Miles was also an ex-MPC member of Imperial College. Their points of disagreement kind of converge on the same point still. So it's like, you know, coming to the point of design, whether those who are doing it have the capability of delivering it. So it's still the same, you know, even though there's like dissenting, but amongst the economic experts that was asked here, the points of where it dissents comes to the same kind of like area, which is capabilities, whether it's how it's designed, etc. Yeah, use research. Yeah, so he's agree or disagree because balance of evidence is there's some are okay, some are not. It depends on how it's designed. So next thing, okay. So a few things. These are just like now we are. So the framing of this whole research is like the design of it. So this is like some kind of like just background overview of like what things have done elsewhere. So this is like, for example, when we think about industrial policy, at least in the classic economic literature, is like the most classic examples you think about is like East Asia, and this is like the most classic of classic examples. Japan's 1960s to 80s perhaps. MITI, Ministry of International Trade and Industry. So what they've kind of like clustered is this called super ministry approach, because MITI is basically like the all-powerful ministry with a huge amount of coordinating power, amount of convening power, and it basically not controls, but controls the flow of like the funds from the Development Bank of Japan, where it funds, where it channels to its what kind of industrial development strategy. The other opposite spectrum of kind of like very heavy-handed state approach is the US. You know, the US, this is like kind of like the work by Erica Folks, it basically stating in the US, it's not like there's a clear body, like a state-driven kind of approach, but what everyone cites is like things like DARPA, where there is a huge amount of coordinating role that it provides. It's not really like a complete hands-off or a hands-on approach from the state. It's more of the state as a coordinating function within the space. And she cited that the role of DARPA is so successful that it's combined provided the space for industries that traditionally don't work with each other, like healthcare, energy, military industry, to work together at different stages, like startups and big firms at different kind of like bodies, whether private sector or federally funded institutes. So this is the space where they all come and converge towards a specific, publicly declared kind of like objectives, which are set by both the Defense Department and the US Congress. So this is kind of like, the DARPA is like this perfect space for all this kind of like magic to happen, essentially. So, but there's those kind of things. So like, although this is hardly like complete picture, but there is some kind of idea what the contours of industrial policy in East Asia is, in the US is. You know, you can see where, what is the machinery that really generates this, delivers these policies. So essentially, to understand the UK's context, I've been working with Professor Diane Coyle at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy here in Cambridge, and basically we decided to look and understand the kind of like foundational documents that build up these, first of all, these ministries and institutions and agencies, and basically how well the coordination of policies from these departments, ministries, agencies across with other parts of the government, basically. So essentially, it's two parts. So it's first qualitative text analysis, basically mapping out, tracing out what are the basic relationships between ministries, their jurisdictions, and their funding relationships, essentially. And then the next one is essentially to track from these kind of texts, to track where, how deeply integrated certain policies are within other ministries. So for example, in 2017, the UK has a major document called the 2017 Industrial Strategy. What essentially under that policy document, there's a host of other policies that's nested under there. How well is it taken up by other ministries beyond this Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy department? So just to paint what I was talking about, a quick one. This approach it's not really well developed, but it's kind of like being explored. This text analysis is kind of like the new Wild West, so to speak. So Nyman and it's a Bank of England working paper looking at the sentiments of financial markets and how, newspapers and how it affects financial markets. Curie et al. Basically talks about the development of economic methodologies that is described within economic papers throughout the years and see how they evolve. So that's the kind of like thinking that, this kind of like similar, let's look at what kind of language is used in policy papers. Are there like similarities here and there, etc. So first of all, the qualitative part. Tracking is a little bit difficult because over the years there's like a bajillion papers that's produced by the government, and there's a high degree of political cyclicality towards these papers. But essentially, what's made it more difficult is that just looking at the most recent years, every single year there's almost likely to be a paper that's superseding the previous papers, and it's difficult to trace how a certain policy morphs into the next. So that's kind of like a tricky thing to do with this particular paper. So what we're doing is basically look at snapshots of certain periods of time, so that we just understand at that particular period what was the prevailing policies, what was happening then. So this is like as of September 2021. This is just our very simplified mapping. We don't claim this is like the entirety of the UK government, but essentially there's like, first of all, a few things. We can see little pockets. So there's like the MOD on its own, a little bit, NHS, but the large part of it, all of this, essentially traces back to the Treasury. So Treasury is a major, it's almost a super ministry approach, sort of, but not explicit enough to say, in a sense, like MITI has a very clear directive of development. Treasury is, there was a paper, an article came out a few weeks ago, I guess, but basically says the Treasury kind of like rolls up a few departments into one. It's a budgetary department, it's a finance department, it's also an economic development department. So this is kind of like the contours of the extent of the Treasury, so to speak. And just to point out, like, the consistency challenges that we've notified here is, for example, in the 20th century, the UK had this thing called the Defense Ministry has this thing called DERA, which is Defense Evaluation and Research Agency. Early 2000s, that got sold off, became privatized, sold off to Carlyle Group. And then a small remnant of that became this thing called DSTL, Defense Science and Tech Lab. And now today, they're rebuilding another kind of like DARPA-esque body called ARIA. So that's one instance. Another instance is green infrastructure. So again, I think about a decade ago, there's this thing called Green Investment Bank, again sold off to a private company. A small remnant was still under the government holdings, Green Investment Platform. But now the government has now rebuilt another one, another body, UK Infrastructure Bank, with a big remit under that infrastructure bank was to provide green financing for climate risk adaptation and mitigation projects. So there's a lot of these kind of like stories all around. What Henry mentioned, Cambridge MIT Institute was also actually funded by the Treasury back in the 90s. I think late 2010, the mid 2010s, the Treasury stopped funding it. It was picked up by corporate sponsors like BP, but then it didn't pick up, and it's kind of like left, to float away, But basically, that's kind of like the idea. You know, it's very haphazard. It's very hard to say, and especially for a parliamentary democracy at the UK, to understand the policy vehicles that is available for the government to impact government. I mean, people's lives. It's very important to understand what those vehicles are. They don't just prop up in and out, and there's no. The National Audit Office, the UK's National Audit Office, has also mentioned that there was not enough evaluation. Evidence-based evaluation is what kind of like the name of the game that is. But there's not even enough evaluation to say that, for example, the Green Investment Bank was the privatization of Green Investment Bank was necessary at a given time. So it's very much driven by political factors rather than actual evidence-based kind of thing. So we can't even say it's evidence-based because there's not much evidence, so to speak. So that's kind of like the qualitative side of things. So then we look at the quantitative text. So the strategy here is relatively simple. It's called the dictionary technique approach. So basically, on the top end, we just identified a few like quote-unquote foundational documents for industrial policy. So we decided that these are the kind of like the documents that are underpin the key policy infrastructures for industrial policy instruments. We selected all these kind of like basically the terms that they use in those documents, and then on the bottom end here we bulk extract texts from policy documents and sort them by ministries and check for similarities between those two, the search terms and the bulk of the text that we provided. So the first round is just a very simple one, just the industrial strategy text with the latest leveling up white paper that they've published 2nd of February 2022. So this is quite a new one, as it was promoted by the government as like the new, again, another new flagship document that we're going to fix the UK once and for all. So this is, we just check how okay, if being agnostic to whatever the contents are, what are the permeation of policies from the previous documents to the current one. So we could just, so basically we look at all these search terms and see what are the similarities, what is picked up, what's killed, so to speak. So this is from the 2017 industry strategy. These are like this a selection of all the search terms. The majority of all of them are killed, essentially. I mean, they're not spoken, they're not picked up in some shape form. They're left, to basically decay away. Some of them are picked up for what it's worth. These are the plan for growth. So 2017 industry strategy was 2017. The plan for growth was 2021, which is a little bit more recent. So you have a bit more overlap, up to like this point. Then then these other things like R&D, places strategy, it was not picked up at all. So when you think about industrial strategy and industrial policy, especially when you think about a holistic, a more macro perspective, you would think about a more holistic approach. For example, if you're talking about leveling up, white paper talks a lot about correcting for regional imbalances. And if you're talking about regional imbalances, you want to start thinking about improving transport networks. You want to talk about improving low carbon energy transition kind of like initiatives. You want to talk about improving business development, SME exporting things. So there's a lot of policy domains that goes into the question of, like, for example, correcting regional imbalances. So that's kind of like, if this is a proxy measure of like how some things are put forward. For example, lots of things about literally building houses, I guess, and community regeneration, which is perhaps a big political issue. But the rest, for example, I mean, I can't say, like, emissions trading, seeing green, that's not picked up at all. So it's you can see the kind of like contours of what they're doing and what they're not doing. So just quickly skim through industry strategy. Again, most of it nothing. As far as economic sectors, this is outside of the terms that they've used. These are just sectors that they've highlighted. You can also see like the balance of what they're focusing on, and there's a little bit more, so to speak, continuity in this sense. Yeah, that's that. The next one and the final one is just to wrap up. We did the same thing, but now we're looking at a bigger sample size. So we just looked at a selection of 85 documents from all these agencies, and we did the same thing essentially. And the bulk majority of it is empty. There's a lot of things that are not picked up, and these are across like more documents, not just one. And and it's sensitive that if it's mentioned even once, it'll be picked up, and a lot of it is not picked up at all. It's not mentioned. BBB, it's the British Business Bank, BPC, UKEF, UK Export Finance, DCMS, Culture, Media, and I forgot what the S is. A lot of it is not picked up. So it tells you a lot about what the priorities are as far as the policy execution goes. It shows that perhaps certain forms of jurisdictional turf or something. That is a bit hard. That one is trying to extend it a little bit more than what we have. But at least the data we show, it's a lot of it is missing. So just to wrap, same thing. A lot of it is missing. So essentially, at the end of the day, this is an ongoing research work. So what we hope to do is, at the moment we're looking now, so we started as one leveling up white paper. We expanded it to the scope of 85 policy papers. Now we're looking at literally everything. We're bulk mining everything that the government's published after the publication of a certain document. So that's what we're working on. The next is to include other forms of count metrics. So document term frequency was what I showed you, which is the frequency of how certain terms are showed. But we could extend it to other forms, which is more, which perhaps shows how distinctive they are, what kind of combination of words are often associated with those kind of key terms, or even, for example, what kind of entities are associated with those kind of keywords. So that's hopefully in the pipeline and in the future. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Well, Adam, absolutely fascinating quantitative insights into things that we, generally speaking, only talk about qualitatively. I have an eye on the clock, and again, I think we'll pick up some of these points in our later discussions. Can I thank everybody for a really fascinating morning, tremendously rich. What a tour d'horizon of the issues in industrial policy, sprinkled with new ideas and things which will very much form the meat of our discussions over the next couple of days, with apologies to those of you who are online who I'm afraid won't be with us. I hope our presenters will be kind enough to give, if they wish, give their slides to Sarah so that people can access them online, together with your contact details, and I'm sure you won't mind if people who are viewing from outside get in touch with you with specific questions. So thank everybody very much. Thank you for those of you who've joined from outside, and I think that's us done. Thank you very much indeed.